A very warm welcome to you all. This is the fourth webinar in our Matters of Care conference series, which is being hosted by us at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford in the UK and is part of a larger project called the Taking Care Project, which is co-funded by Creative Europe and is a organised group of ethnographic and world cultures museums across Europe. And as you can find more about the project on takingcareproject.eu. So there are 6 different webinars in our Matters of Care series. This is the 4th one in the series, so if you'd like to catch up on any of the ones that we have had previously, please find recordings of those webinars on the Pitt Rivers YouTube account. And for more information on registering for the upcoming webinars for the last 2 in our series, please feel free to have a look at the Pitt Rivers website for upcoming events, or also the Taking Care Project website where you can register. And thank you, Beth, for putting those into the chat. So as I said, each webinar is being recorded, and then after this live event, the recordings will be going onto our YouTube channel. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. Please feel free to use the chat function as well as the question and answer function in Zoom. So the only thing about today's session is that because of the time difference between Hawaii and the UK, it is a pre-recorded session today. So it means that our fantastic guest speaker, Cissy, is unable to be with us live. However, she's very keen to look at the chat and the questions that have come in today, and then answer them when she wakes up on the other side of the world. So what that means is please feel free to comment, put any kind of general comments in the chat, and then as you're watching the session, if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function. If I can answer any of the questions at the end of the webinar, I will. Otherwise, we will be sending all of the chat and the question and answers, or sorry, the questions to Cissy, and she and her group will be answering your questions. And then when we put up the recording of today's session on our YouTube channel, we'll put your questions and the answers from Cissy underneath the video. So your questions will be answered. There might just be a slight time delay. So please feel free to continue to ask questions with the Q&A function. So this is a really delight to be welcoming also our 2 students. Each webinar we have postgraduate students who are affiliated with us at the museum and have been live tweeting about the event on the Pitt Rivers Twitter account. So today we're really, really grateful to have with us 2 PhD students, Hadika Khan and Hannah Easton. They're both affiliated with the Pitt Rivers Museum in their PhD research. Hadika is a PhD student in anthropology and archaeology at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. And Hannah is a PhD student in anthropology at the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography here in Oxford. And so a very warm welcome to Hannah and Hadika, and we really appreciate having some different comments and on the sessions, and it's been really, really fantastic to have our students be engaged and involved with us. So now that all of the housekeeping and welcomes and introductions, I'd like to really just introduce our fantastic speaker today in this session that we pre-recorded on Tuesday because of the time difference, but it was just a fantastic and feel very privileged at the Pitt Rivers to have Cissy Serrao as part of our museum community, but also that she and her group of quilters were able to spend so much time sharing their just completely in-depth knowledge of Hawaiian quilting. So Cissy is the director of the Poakalani Quilting School and Guild in Honolulu, Hawaii. And she, as you'll hear in the session, she tells lots of really fantastic stories about her parents, John and Poakalani, who really revitalized the art of Hawaiian quilting when they set up the guild and school back in the 1980s. And she has a fantastic community of quilters who we were also very privileged to have on the call with us, sharing their stories, sharing their insights, sharing their incredible knowledge of not only the art of Hawaiian quilting, but also how connected this craft and this art is to Hawaiian culture. And there's just so much richness in the session, which I'm very delighted to be able to share with you, and really just the joy and passion of this group of individuals for what they do, I think really comes through. And so to introduce the Pitt Rivers colleagues who were also on the call with us. So we have Jeremy Uden, who is the head of conservation at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and he has lots of interest in textiles, being a weaver, but also running a weaving school, and lots of interest in textile conservation. We have Misa Tamura, who is a senior conservator here at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and Misa is day-to-day very busy caring for our textile collections and has a strong interest in telling these stories and thinking about the threads that weave together our textile collection. And then finally on the call, we have Marinka Thompson Odlen, who is a researcher at the museum. And Marinka is really our connection with Cissy and started this fantastic partnership and collaboration with Cissy and the museum, because Marinka won an Art Fund UK New Collecting Award at the end of last year. And as part of Marinka's New Collecting Award, she will be working with Cissy and the Poakalani family to collect some of the quilts for our collection. So Marinka talks a little bit as well about that and about that project and our partnership with Poakalani School, which we're absolutely delighted to be a part of that. So without further ado, I'm going to start the pre-recorded session, and then I'll come back at the end to wrap everything up. But please do enjoy. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to really thank the Pitt Rivers Museum for allowing us to be here and have this conversation, and to Ashley, who organized all of this, and especially Marinka, who I've been talking to back and forth on the project that we're working on. I've reached out to the quilters I wanted to, and but not all of them. I'm still reaching out to them, so don't blame me if February that you can actually make a quilt museum of Hawaiian quilts, because you're probably going to get them all. And so it's an exciting project that we're working on. I'd like to thank Misa for joining us, and Jeremy. It's just an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be part of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And I know this is a long time coming. We've worked on this for over a year, but we're really here because of a passion that we have. And if you notice that when the speakers, all the people who are here, they've been here with us in quilting for 15, 20 years. What happens is they start and we never let them go. We just hang on to all of you. But quilting is a passion that started 40 years ago with my parents, and I can't believe that our classes have been going on for 40 years. And some of you have been with us for 20 years, even 15 years, where they're 5 years that, you're still here and you're still doing the work. It is so, so important for us, especially, all John and Whakalani, and why we started the classes, or why they started the classes. And it was to share this amazing tradition that started all the way back in the 1820s, when that first ship came over, the Thaddeus, and they docked in the harbor, and they had the first Hawaiian quilting circle. And by doing some research, what they did was they did this patchwork sewing, and you guys probably all know the history. And Hawaiians just didn't adapt to this patchwork. They didn't like it. They didn't like cutting fabric. They didn't like putting it back together. And so eventually, how so smart and ingenious the Hawaiians were, that they were able to find a new technique that not just reflected Hawaii, but it reflected their tradition. It reflected their culture. And, some people say that the designs that we have now, we saw our background, actually came from the tapa, the old fabric that the Hawaiians used. And these designs were developed into what we have today. And these happens in the 1840s, 1860s, these new fabric, new designs were coming out, which what we know today as Hawaiian quilting. And it is so unique. You can go anywhere in the world today and you will know what a Hawaiian quilt is, and what it means and what its tradition is. And I think part of the classes that we teach is we really want to emphasize not just the sewing technique, because the sewing technique came from the missionaries. They taught us how to applique, they taught us how to quilt, but it was always in the design that was important. It was always cutting your fabric in one piece, in that 1/8 piece or that 1/4 piece, and able to get 2 pieces of fabric and then just, put it on your backing and applique and sew it. There was so much meaning and love. And I don't think people realize that. And I think Pat does, but Pat's speedy here. For many of us, it takes a long time to make a Hawaiian quilt. You can't just make it in a day or 2 days or 3 days. It's a time. It takes time to do that. And I always tell the quilters, they say, well, Cissy, how long does it take to make a Hawaiian quilt? I said, well, for a full-size one, maybe, 9 months or a year or 5 or maybe 10 or 20. But it all depends on how much effort and how much work that you put into the quilt. And I have to say, for all the quilters here and the quilters who were not able to come, what an amazing, amazing group of women. And we do have a couple men in the class, how amazing you are. Because we always try with the Poakalani class, and this is my whole family that's here today, is that it's passing on a tradition. We really need to keep this going. And I get so afraid, and I think all of you know that too. If you go out into Hawaii, how many people do you know actually quilt the Hawaiian style that we do? It is a very small group. It is a very small niche. And I think all of you should be proud of what you do, because this tradition, we don't want it to stop and die. And we want to keep on doing it. And that's why I always say, Nobuko is teaching now, Yoshimi is teaching now, all of you here can actually go out and teach what we do. And I think what was unique about our classes is, and I always call it John's and Poakale's class, because while Tuffy and I, we worked with the beginner's table, we taught the technique of quilting. It was really John who really brought you in to really teach you about why we do it, what we do, how important. And the number one thing about Hawaiian quilting that makes it so, so unique is the stories. And every time John was quilting or, going to teach you how to design or was designing something for you, he would always say, so what's your story? What story can you tell me? What can I do? What can you make that you can pass on to your family that they will be able to look at? And, I know with Marinka, we always, we're talking about labeling, and, we're so adamant with our quilters, after you finish your quilt, you got to put the label on. You really, really have to put that label on who quilted it and the date, who designed it. And because if you look at the old antique quilts, there is no information on it. I think Pat knows. Pat always says that, Cissy, what about this quilt? What is the pattern? Maybe, and, you have to do a lot of research to find out. We don't know who the designers are. We don't know who the quilters are. And that's something that we try to emphasize with the quilters. And when I talk about the quilters, and I don't like to talk about, me or us, it's we. It's just the whole group itself. John was always the one to say, because he was our designer, and he was always one to say, Cissy, my designs mean nothing. It's just squiggly lines on a piece of paper. It's the quilters who bring it to life. They're the ones that cut out the design. They're the ones that give it its love. And for him, he was always so, and Tuffy and I also, so proud and happy that you brought this tradition to life, and it's still being brought to life. And we are just so appreciative of what all of you do. And we're hoping that COVID gets over real fast so we can continue what we're doing. But the art itself is amazing. And I don't think people realize that 40 years ago, on a whim, and I don't know if Nisa or Jeremy knows that my mom had this absolute passion for quilting, and she was raised by her grandmother. She would just watch her grandmother quilt, and my grandmother would have my great-grandmother, her grandmother would have these quilting classes, and they would come in and she would watch, and she just loved it. But her grandmother would never, ever let her touch the needle. And I don't think you guys or some people, you realize that my mom only had one hand. And because she only had one hand, grandma just said, no, don't want to, hurt your finger or cut your finger. And so it wasn't until she married my dad, who was from a family of quilters. And Grandma Serrao, she quilted, her mother quilted, her grandmother quilted, her great-grandmother quilted. And we did a genealogy on our family. And actually, one of John's relatives was on that ship at the very first quilting circle. And that is something that we are so proud of, to have that tradition come down, to us, that we're still doing it. And it was through my parents getting married that my mom finally told my dad, I want to quilt. And my dad said, okay, let's try. And I think a lot of you realize that when you did a quilt pattern back in the days of the 1820s, 30s, or even when mom started getting into quilting, you did the big one, the 90 by 90, the 108 by 108. You did what actually went on a bed. There was no such thing as cushions or wall hangings or baby cribs, and you just cut out the big one. That's why we keep Pat in her job, because there's many people who never ever finish their quilts, and Pat is one of our wonderful quilters who will finish these quilts. They take them out of the closet, and any referrals I get saying, my grandma made this quilt and I wanted to get it finished. I said, call Pat. Pat will finish it for you. And she does. And she does an amazing job. And so when my mom started quilting, she couldn't do the larger ones. So my dad went into a lot of the patterns that we inherited, and he, inspired by it, he brought it to a very small 22 by 22. And that's how the classes started. You started your class with a 22 by 22. And in our classes, we do have, and I think everybody experienced this, the beginner's table. You know, you start at the beginner's table, you learn how to make a small piece. And that's the table that we laugh about because we said, it's where you're going to perfect your stitches. It's where you're going to learn it, how you're going to learn some of the traditions. And if we see you the next week, that's really good. If we don't, then maybe it wasn't for you. Or if you finish your piece, and Marinka's going, yeah. When you finish your piece, you can decide, I really love this, and I'm going to make a bigger one, or I'm going to make another one. Or you're going to say, did it, done it, never going back there again. Because like I said, the quilter's passion is amazing, and it's not for everybody. The quilters actually work their way up to the larger quilts, and it's a community effort. A lot of the quilters will help with the laying of it and the basting of it. But I need to talk about my mother because she only had one hand. In fact, all of the quilts behind here are hers, and my dad would frame them in koa. She couldn't teach. She couldn't make her own large size quilts because of having only one hand. But her quilting classes were getting so big that the women were asking for the larger quilts. And John, learning his designing, he started designing wall hangings and the larger size quilts. And it's amazing because she did go to the quilters and says, I cannot do a big quilt, but I can teach you how. And she did. And many of the quilters here have learned from her and how amazing she was and how patient she was. There was never an excuse for her. She was funny. There was never an excuse for her that you could not sew, because she would always raise her hand, which was no hand. And she goes, really? You can't do it? And that was her inspiration and why, we're still doing. There was no excuse for Tuffy and I being raised by a mom with only one hand, because if she could do it, we better know how to do it too. And we do. And it's amazing. I don't know what more to tell about the quilting classes. There's a lot of traditions involved with the quilts, and I know all of our quilters know the traditions. Most of us, I think, we do work with cotton fabric, and we do pre-wash all our fabric. I hopefully I would say yes, we all pre-wash our fabric. And what we're that's laughing. My mom used poly blends. She used poly cotton. Why did she use poly cotton? Because at the time that she was teaching, that's all that came into the islands. So she got used to using the poly blends, fell in the poly blends. She never, ever used 100% cotton. She always told us that the poly blend fabric was color fast and that it would last longer than the cotton fabric. The cotton fabric eventually would fade over time. So that's why these, which is behind me, these are like over 40 years old, and they're still keeping the colors, and they haven't been pre-washed, and they're still beautiful. A lot of the people do prefer the cotton. We do use a lot of the polyester. I don't know if any of the quilters here use cotton for their batting, but I think most of us use the polyester. I worry though about using the polyester because I'm not sure, and that's probably a question for you at the museum, is it, I don't feel it's going to last as long as cotton will. And I know some of the quilters who are working on this project, they're thinking of just using even cotton as their batting because they want to be sure these quilts will last for a very long time. And only time will tell of how long these quilts will actually last. There's a lot of tradition with the quilting, and I know a lot of the ladies here know about it. And one of them is when you finish your full-size quilt, of course, you sleep with it for one night, and that is to seal the love into that quilt. because there's thousands and thousands of stitches in there. Another tradition we have is that you don't sit on the quilt, and this is respect for the quilter. So if you are in a house where there's a quilt on the bed, you can just lift the quilt and then you can sit on the corner. Another tradition is that if you're having a party at the house, and I know Mom did this, and she would put all the quilts out on the bed. And I think one of the reasons why she did that, and she even said, is that when you're having a party and the people go into the rooms, they remember the person who made the quilts. And that person is there at the party with you. And so every time we would have a party, it was like, got to get out the quilts because these people are going to be with us. Other traditions that I kind of made up along the way, and it's only because of certain incidents, is there's a lot of people, of course, the younger quilters who want to make quilts for their grandchildren or even their children, and they'll always come in and say, oh, I want a quilt for a baby, and they would come up with these, can we do teddy bears, can we do elephants? And my advice to them is always make the quilt for the adult child. Instead of having the child grow out of the quilt, let the child grow into the quilt. And so today, when we do baby quilts, the quilts are usually designs like the Hawaiian helmets and the Hawaiian, it's strong designs. So if you have a boy or even a girl, you want them to be strong, you want them to be happy. And that's what usually the design reflects on. So we try not to put those type of designs in a Hawaiian quilt. People always call and say, Cissy, I need a wedding quilt. And I always say, okay. And I said, is it your son or your daughter? And they'll always say, oh, no, it's for my son. And I said, okay. I says, I don't believe in giving wedding quilts. I just don't. I believe that you give the quilt to the person and not for the occasion. I know they're in love and hopefully they'll be married for 50 years, but sometimes it doesn't last for 50 years. And I've heard horrible stories of people fighting over quilts. So I always say, maybe you should just give it to the person instead of the event. And it'll just make it easier if anything happens, and God forbid nothing happens in that case. John also had traditions. I think everybody knows John's tradition of no birds on the quilts. He didn't ever do birds on the quilts. The few times he did do birds, he noticed a trend. Every time he made a bird on a quilt for a quilter, they moved away. They moved to the mainland. Another tradition that is very people follow is you never put humans or people on quilts. And for that tradition, there is a story behind that one too. So of course, we had a quilter who was making the Hawaiian coat of arms, and the Hawaiian coat of arms has two warriors on the quilt. You have, one is Keomoku and Kamanava, and they were King Kamehameha the Great's guardians. And she kept telling John, I really want those two men on the quilt. They have to be on the quilt. And he goes, oh, can't do it. And she just kept bothering him about it. So he said, okay. So he did. Eventually, she moved to Florida. And she was a very good friend of my mom's. And she called one day and she says, Puakalani, my son is sick. And he doesn't sleep at night. And I don't know what's wrong. And, we've been to the doctors and I just don't know what to do anymore. And so she said, my mom told her, that quilt that you made? And she goes, yeah. She goes, why don't you put it on him? Let him sleep with it at night. And, all that love that you put into this quilt, let's see if it'll help him just rest through the night. And about 3 weeks went by. And she called my mom and she says, it's really, he's doing better. He's sleeping at night. He still has medical issues, but he's sleeping through that night, which is making him better. But he wants to know, who's those two men that stand in his room at night?
Scary.
And so, I mean, for us, by telling you these stories, it's not just about tradition or culture. These are actual beliefs of the Hawaiian system, that the spirit is part of the quilt. When you make the quilt, your spirit becomes part of the quilt. And with that, we believe it heals, it soothes you. And for us, every time a quilt is given to someone we love, you're giving love. You're absolutely giving love, because it takes so much time to even make a quilt. And that's why I admire anyone who does a Hawaiian quilt or anyone who does quilting. But for the Hawaiian part of it, there's just so much cultural, spiritual tradition involved in the quilts. And I don't think many people realize that when you go into the older quilts, the vintage quilts, they're not just bird of paradise or, flowers or carnations. Some of these quilts are just, the title itself is amazing. The quilts that we inherited from great grandma, there's one quilt called the Kahili o Enia, tells of the legends of one of the legends in Hawaii, that the Hawaiians may have originated from India. And that's why we have the ulu elikini, the Indian breadfruit. We have a quilt called Molokama. It talks about the mountains on the island of Kauai. When you look into these old patterns, it's amazing. There were even some patterns that we went through, my parents went through, that they took out, they read the title, and they tore up the pattern, and they tossed it, and they said, that's not for us. There was one quilt that nobody does, and I know someone who does it, who did do it, and it was called, you could just take the title of the quilt, and this title was called Kamakani Kaili Aloha. And when my parents saw the quilt, and that was one of them that they tore up, because the quilt was an actual memorial quilt. And it was when you translate the Hawaiian, it means the wind that took my loved one from me. And so when Poaklani and John went through these old patterns, there was a lot that they tossed out, because when the designs were made, they were made for that specific person and no one else. And they didn't want to take any of that spirit and mana from that design that really didn't belong to them. And that's one of the reasons why I think John says he's going to make his own designs, not worry about mana and not worry about that. So when he made it with love. There was no conditions in his designs. And another tradition that John started was, and it continues in our classes, you don't do animals on quilts. You never did animals. And that wasn't a tradition in our class. John loved fishes. And I think all of you know he loves his fish. He has so many fish designs. And he did giraffes. He did, I think he did several animal quilts. And so, but I just want to emphasize one thing, and that is the design. The designs are all cut out on the 1/8. Whether you put animals, whether you put birds, it's cut on the 1/8. It doesn't matter what color fabric you use. It was always done on the 1/8. And the tradition is in the design, not necessarily the fabric or the colors that you choose. And it's because we want to stay within that tradition. So, shall I do it? So I'm going to just share with you. I hope I can share. Is that okay if I share some of the quilts that were designed? So these are just a few of some of the quilts that were done in the class. And, like I said before, with the, you always start with your breadfruit quilt. And this quilt was done by Linda. And it wasn't her first. She did a different type of quilt for her first. So she didn't do the tradition of the doing a breadfruit first. But this is one of her quilts that she did. We also have this quilt is called the Kapika Oliahi, which is the center of a diamond head. And again, this is a quilt of a place. It doesn't always have to be flowers. And this is a vintage design. And what I love about the vintage designs is that you can go and get a vintage design and give it new life with the new fabric, with the new designs, with the new threads. Because back then they only had white thread. This is another vintage design, and I think this is Nobuko's, her taro lily, and this is it is right, Nobuko.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, and again, it's a vintage design. And then this is, to give you an idea of the vintage quilts, you have the lavender on white. That quilt is like from the 1920s, 1930s. And then the other one on the green is done in about 50 years ago. And you can see the better choice of fabric we have now. You had very little fabric choice back then, and what we can do now with these vintage quilts. And again, this is another vintage quilt. This is the Mamo here. And then usually Hawaiian quilts do echo quilting. And this quilt is the chrysanthemum. And you notice that the echo quilting was not done here. It's done in all the squares, cross stitches. 88 chrysanthemums. It had to have 88 chrysanthemums because the Tamako who did the quilt said she wanted to do it for her husband, and it had to have 88 chrysanthemums. And so it took a while for John to figure out how to put 88 chrysanthemums on a quilt. I believe this is Pat's quilt, and this is the, I guess, the heliconia and Hawaii, and you'll see the border lay around the quilt. And with Hawaiian quilting, one of the things that is traditional is the echo quilting. And what you want to do is, for every line that comes out from the center of the quilt, there's a line that comes in from the center of the quilt. And so eventually these quilting echo lines, they meet. And many people believe that it's the love coming out from the center, from Hawaii, and it goes out to outside, and then it is returned. And Monstera quilt here, again, we have our vegetation. And this is Yoshimi's quilt. Again, we're talking about going more than two colors. And I think that's what I like about our tradition is that how many colors you want on your quilt, that's what you're going to get. And then you have, this is Hana's quilt. When we went to Hana, Maui, we had the best time, and she wanted a quilt to remember the event. And this is the quilt that she made. And we nicknamed her Hana, by the way. and Yoko Hana. Okay. So this is John's Sea Life. And I think this is Anne Marie's quilt, and one of my favorite quilts. No, I thought it was. Are you sure? Her fish quilt. And then it's just amazing what we can do. This is a placement. This is a place quilt. Here you have the Iolani Palace lanterns on. And so that's a memory of the Iolani Palace. And banyan tree. There's this huge banyan tree outside of the Kanaina building where we quilt at the Iolani Palace. And so this is a memory quilt of where we quilt. So you can still see the echo lines that always reach out the quilt. I see. Okay. We also have what we call quilts made for people, individuals that whether it's your mother or father, but this quilt is actually what we call the Alii Quilt. we have Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop, and she started the Kamehameha schools where I work. And it's amazing because, again, you have petroglyphs. John did not put humans on this quilt. He put the family petroglyphs. And I just want to finish up with this quilt because I think Marinka then will be fascinated with this one. This was done by Susie. And this quilt is actually called Queen Victoria because Queen Kapi'olani and Queen Liliuokalani actually went to the Jubilee for Queen Victoria. And this quilt was designed in memory of that event. So I'm just going on and on. You guys are so nice. You don't say the word. And so I just wanted to know if there's any questions, or I can go on and on and on. And my quilters know that. I can talk. Marinka knows I can talk all night. So are there any questions? I mean, not just for me, but for anybody else? Yes.
Can I ask a question, Cissy? Thank you very much for your talk. It's really fascinating, and I have so many questions, but I don't hold the stage now. So what comes across to me is the really the importance of community. The quilt bring people together, and look at you as amazing students, and design from families and inspiration from ancestral design and nature. It's wonderful. I just wondered if obviously we live in the age of isolation and travel restriction, and you haven't seen your students for a while, and your students haven't seen each other for a while. I just wondered, what is it like making Hawaiian quilt in the age of this kind of isolation? Has anything changed sort of when you are doing that loving stitches, and probably you are feeling the absence of community? So sorry, it's a very
yes, you're absolutely right. And I think I think you were here when we were all signing on, and we were so happy to see each other because it's been over a year that we've actually gathered in the class. Our last class was, I think, the last week of March, and it was really, really difficult not being with these people. But I think we had built such a strong family community with each other that while we do miss each other, and I know everybody's keeping in contact, we have 4 tables at our classes. We have the beginner's table, where you start off, and once you learn the technique of the classes, you're actually put on different tables, and we have 3 other tables. We do have a Japanese table, and it's only because we do get a lot of quilters who don't speak English, and I do have teachers who are actually sitting at that table, like Takako and Yuko, and they assist the students there. The other two tables is we call the round table because it's round, and then you have Pat's table. We call it Pat's table, and it's quite amazing because these ladies get to know each other. They really do. And they become such good friends. And I owe a lot of that to, I think, Susan, who's there, and Pat and Carla. You have certain people on these tables who are the communicators. They are the ones that keep in touch. They are the ones that are constantly making sure that everything's okay. And, just to let you know, if I need to reach out to anyone, all I need to do is to reach out to one person on that table, and they will go ahead and they'll do their quilt tree.
Well, I just wanted to say that Cissy mentioned community, and in my situation, I've been very fortunate to finish quilts for other people or do commissions for other people. And that has spread all over the United States. I mean, I've made good friends from people who asked me to either make a quilt for them or finish a quilt that their grandma started or something. Just, I can't express it, but it's just a spreading out of the community. And they are all so appreciative, and it just makes them happy to get a finished Hawaiian quilt. And that's been more of a gift to me than me giving to them. But when Cissy was talking about putting your love in a quilt, it's you put your mana in it, your spirit into the quilt. And I do sleep under every quilt I make for one night before it gets given away. And I think that's part of the community too, that energy.
I believe that. And you know, the thing is too, because sometimes I can't sleep under the quilts because I do a lot of baby quilts. But for
That's
every
okay, put
quilt,
it on your hip.
I know, I do that too. But what I do is I pray over my quilts. Every single, whether it's a pillow, if it's a baby quilt, whatever I do, when it's done, it gets prayed over. And then I give it as a gift. You know, and it's the same thing. It's my mana, my aloha comes into that quilt. And but you know, we are in Ohana. We are a family. You know, everybody. It's we treat each other like sisters. You know, the kids, the grandkids that come, they're like our nieces. They're like our grandkids. You know, everybody's kids are our kids. You know, and it goes back to, you know, it's the Hawaiian culture. It's the Polynesian culture.
I think a good story to tell about the community within our Kalani Ohana is when my dad passed away. He passed away like 12:30 at night, and I only needed to call not 4 people that night that he passed away. And I called, you know, I think it was Lynette and Takako. And just by calling 4 people, you know, the word went out. It's amazing because Tuffy and I and our family really didn't have to do anything. The quilters did everything. They did everything. They were the ones that provided the pastries. Carla and her husband, I'm so forever grateful. They came early to set up some quilts for the show. And I think that, I mean, not the show, but for Dad. And they were the ones that took the flowers to the grave. And for me, that was the true sign that we are a family. It was amazing. They held us up, and they're still holding us up. And I think we're all holding each other up with that. And it wasn't my blood relatives on my mom's side or my dad's side that helped us and got us through. It was the quilters. And I will always remember that. And I am so grateful that we have this ohana. And I appreciate them so much. Yeah. Does anybody have anything?
I think I can build on that. For all the years that we've been quilting, I haven't done the classes when my mom was sick. I was the one that stayed home and took care of my mom, and Cissy and Dad was the one that would do the classes. And it wasn't until I came back, and the reason is Cissy and Dad would come home and they would talk about the new quilters and the quilters they've had for a long time. I had no idea who they were talking about until I went to class, and then I finally put the names to the faces, and I'm going, wow, so you're so-and-so, you're so-and-so. And I think, if anything, we are so blessed because of all the students that have crossed in our lives and how they have connected and made friends with each other. Because I really don't think quilting is just the culture and the art and the stitches and everything, all the hard work you put into it. it's basically everybody coming together, and we all come from different walks of lives, and quilting has brought us closer together than just the art itself. And it's an amazing tool. And everybody agrees.
Absolutely.
You know,
I'm
Cissy. Oh,
Sorry, I was just going to ask a question. I'm hearing that, you know, the sense of community around quilting and the respect for traditional designs and the, you know, the knowledge that some designs have mana and you don't want to replicate them. How do you feel that maybe some of these historic designs are available, you know, through the internet and museums, and that people are maybe copying them, but without thinking about Hawaiian tradition or kind of respecting the kind of things that you teach in your lessons?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that's one of the reasons why when Mom and Dad started the quilting class, they were not going to take any historical patterns unless it was from our collection, and they never touched them. We as Hawaiians who were raised in the Hawaiian culture, we know better. The other people don't know better. And unless we educate them on it, you know, and that's hard. Just to tell you a story about that, we had a quilter that came to the class, and she asked my dad to make a quilt with 3 dolphins. And if you know Hawaiian quilting, everything is 1/8, you know, everything is duplicated. You can't do 3 dolphins. You can do 4 dolphins, you can do 8 dolphins, you can't do 3 dolphins. But she was adamant. She says, I need 3 dolphins and I need it fast. So he did a design with 3 dolphins. It wasn't duplicated or anything. He just drew 3 dolphins with the lei and everything. And she said, just make the design and I'll tell you about it later. And he said, okay. So like, I think it was like not even 6-7 months down the line, she finished the quilt. She did finish it, but she goes back and she tells a story. She had 3 nephews, 3 brothers. I mean, and 3 of them were brothers. Within that, her family, this was her, I don't know if it was her brother's or her sister's family. The 2 brothers had passed away. One had died of AIDS and one had an accident. The last brother was in the hospital and he was dying of AIDS. And at the time that she visited her nephew, the nephew said, can you please make a quilt for my mom and dad to remember us when I'm gone? And she did. And when she finished it, she took the quilt to the hospital and she showed it to her nephew. And he just loved it. And he said to give it to his mother after he passes. And I think he passed away like maybe 2 weeks after she finished the quilt. And she gave the quilt to her sister or brother. And they were just amazed. And the story that they got behind, that they were free. They were free like dolphins. They were free to be wherever they want. And this family took this quilt and they toured with the quilt. And they gave talks about the 3 sons that they lost. They had lost all 3, and about what they went through and about the quilt itself. Someone took pictures of this quilt and they put it on the internet. And usually every once in a while, I'll go and I'll, you know, Google Hawaiian quilting just to see, you know, what everybody is doing and what's happening. And there was the quilt, and it wasn't quilt. Somebody had duplicated the quilt. And I went and I found out who it was. And I was so angry. And I called them up and I said, where did you get the design? And they said, oh, we saw it on the internet. We just fell in love with it. So we duplicated the design. And I needed to explain to them that that was a memorial quilt. And that quilt was made for 3 brothers who were now deceased. And I had to educate them that if you don't know where the design came from, and if you don't know who made it, don't touch it. Because every design has mana. And not every design had good mana in it. Some of them had bad mana, which gives me to another story about my great-grandmother, because she was amazing and wonderful most of the time. So she quilted. She had quilting classes at her home. And her neighbor across the street, no, it wasn't your mom, Kaylee, they got in an argument. And so what happened was she hung her quilt outside on the clothesline to dry. And Grandma, from what I understand, saw the design. And she duplicated it. And she made it. And she hung it on her clothesline just to spite the other person. Is that a good story to tell? No, but but they did that too. But yeah, it's a hard question. For me, is that they shouldn't, for patterns and all, they shouldn't copy historical designs unless they know who the designer is. If the design came from a specific family, from that family, and the family knows about it and passes it on to them, then of course. But if you go into Waianae Library or the Bishop Museum and you start taking patterns from that, I wouldn't recommend it at all.
I think another aspect of what Jeremy asked is that what we have to deal with nowadays in Hawaii, I see it in Waikiki all the time, are the imported quote unquote quilts that have been, I don't know if they have been worked on by several women at once or if they are mass produced. They're usually, correct me if I'm wrong, Cissy, they're from the Philippines or Indonesia.
And Thailand, Taiwan, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I understand that people sometimes can't afford an authentic Hawaiian quilt, but it almost, not demeans us, but it takes away from the whole tradition and history and meaning behind a quilt to go buy it at the store. You know, so when especially when I people inquire about having me make a quilt and I quote them a price and they're going, what? And they don't understand. To make a quilt, it takes 1,000 hours of your life. And they think they can just go in a store and buy it, you know, and that misconception it sometimes bothers me quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's why I always tell the quilter, and if you're making a quilt for your son or your daughter or your brother or your sister, be sure that they see you making the quilt. Be sure that they see you putting all these stitches in the quilt so they can really understand how much work that you're putting into the quilt. I think that's so important. Some people say, oh, I want to surprise, you know, my son or my daughter. I say, no, don't surprise them. Let them know how hard you're working on this. They would really appreciate the work that you're putting into this and all that love that you're putting into this. So for me, is that don't hide the quilts from your family. Show them what you're working on. Show them what you're doing. Yeah.
You know, I just want to say that I was one of them that I thought, oh, I just go to Waianae Library and pick a pattern that, you know, is like, looks pretty to me. But after I started quilting with you and I heard your stories, I thought, oh, what am I doing? John, can you do me a pattern, please? Can you this is my story. But, you know, in answer to the question about the pandemic, you know, I do miss the classes.
although I know we're all still quilting because, you know, talking to everybody else, you know, through text or phone calls or what have you, it sounds like everybody is still quilting the Paukalani way. And, you know, we're all waiting to get back to class. Everybody's back trying to get vaccinated, and hopefully soon we'll be able to get together and meet in person again.
Yeah, and I think most
I'm glad that you
everyone
said
gets
that, Marna,
vaccinated.
because I think our quilt show is going to be huge because you guys have had all this time to work on more pieces. So
You're right there.
I have to tell Jeremy and Misa that John was always, and Poakalani, is that we have a quilt show every 2 years. It is something that it was so important that you always show the work of the quilters and all the work that they put on. We can't do it every year because it takes longer to make the larger size quilt, except for Pat. She can do 4. Do a Pat show. But it was important. So I think, yeah, Carla, I think you're right. When we get back to class and we have our next quilt show, it's going to be huge because everybody's still quilting. We can have it in Oxford.
Yeah.
What are you trying to rope me into?
Can I ask what is going to be entailed with the exhibition, Marinka or Jeremy or Misa, whoever can answer that?
So that'll be me. So I don't know, Cissy's probably told you, but this is part of like a larger collecting process we're trying to do in a way that's not only contemporary collecting, but also in which we kind of try to foreground all these stories that you've been telling us, and you know, the people behind the makers, the quilters, because in our museum and in a lot of museums, those stories aren't really told. You know, the people behind those objects kind of get lost. Like, I'm trying to do the kind of mini like weekend exhibitions, you know, so people can come in and drop in and see and see all of it, you know, kind of together with that space. So it'd be not where they would be kind of displayed permanently, but at least in a, you know, trying to have people come in. But also I really want to show, like, as you said, the work that went behind it. So that's why I think I was talking to Cissy about just social media. So you kind of see like the progress. You know, I want people to know that this is something that took a lot of time and energy and love. And I really want to work with you all kind of around that, especially kind of the ideas of pieces that you said, like duplications. You know, because people will come in and they may want to take photos. If that's something that you might not like, then, you know, if you tell me that in advance, then I can put signage up. Or maybe there are some that people can kind of, you know, try on their own. Or there are some that are, you know, you would say, no, this should not be duplicated. It's very much kind of, you know, what you feel, like your feelings behind it, and that I can work into kind of the acquisition contract. So, you know, we have that, you know, kind of there, in a way, kind of to protect the quilts and the tradition and the heritage as well. Because, yeah, I'm very kind of conscious that this is like a cultural practice and heritage. And so I want to kind of work with you in the best way to be able to ensure that, yes, we share this, you know, with everybody, but also we don't get someone trying to kind of, you know, mass produce, you know, your designs. And yeah, and like, I just basically want like all these, like, just all the stories that you've just like told me kind of behind it, and for the specific designs that you're making for the museum, like racking my brain to think of ways of how to showcase that in like a, you know, a museum space, which can be difficult, but I think like we can, you know, together we can work with it to find out, even if it's maybe doing like little mini video clips, you know, if you're talking about your design, and anything you feel that you would like to share about it. Because I really want people to, if they are inspired to get into Hawaiian quilting, to understand, you know, why they're getting into it, and to kind of want to be part of that ohana, as you call it. But I should also say that I too have tried hula and now quilting. All virtually, of course. I am lucky there is a school, a London school of hula, actually. set up by some wonderful people who are originally from Hawaii. And so I've been learning over Zoom, and it is really hard on the knees. But what's also been great is that kind of looking at all the designs as well is the connection. I'm from the Caribbean, St. Lucia, a small island called St. Lucia. And so many of the designs have actually been, I was like, oh, I recognize that. Like the quilt I'm working on is 22 by 22, and it's the anthurium lily flower. And I chose that one because that's like, my house is like, my mom's a florist, and so our entire garden, she actually sells anthurium lilies as well as cut flowers. And so that was something that I was like, I like recognize this, but also the breadfruit, you know, that is actually our national dish in St. Lucia. And it's really funny because in the Caribbean, like we don't really think of the breadfruit as being from anywhere else. We kind of think of ourselves as this like the chain of islands being isolated. And so every time I come across this, like the breadfruit in other places and, you know, seeing it kind of represented in the quilts all the time, it gives me this kind of sense of connectivity to a different place. And of course, the breadfruit isn't from the Caribbean originally. You know, it was brought over from kind of the Polynesian islands in the 18th century, and it was brought over specifically to be propagated in the Caribbean to feed enslaved people. So it's very much entrenched in that kind of Caribbean history. And I think it's just, I have kind of gained this larger connectivity as you have with the, you know, you have people from like California and Hawaii and Japan here, and you have this kind of almost like cross-Pacific connection. And, you know, we're Caribbeans technically in the Atlantic, but now I feel like I want to kind of connect all our areas in that way, because we do have this kind of shared history that I'm kind of learning through the quilting patterns. And that's kind of made me very happy during lockdown, where I've just basically be at home by myself, but also kind of making me rethink my own heritage. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, and sorry for like talking so long. Also, I might show you guys my quilt so far. It's pretty bad, so please don't laugh, because I've been trying to like do this all on my own. But yeah, this is as far as I've gotten.
Nice.
So yeah, it's, you know, it'd be great if I could be there with you at the beginner's table. But yeah, it's been a slow process, but I'm really enjoying it. And it's a way to kind of decompress in the evenings, you know, and focus on a happy place.
Could I also, from what Marinka was talking about earlier, about the sort of a collecting stories that, you know, you've been all sharing, and you know, it really brings your work to life. And you know, I always think people like Jeremy, me, Marinka, Ashley, we are in an extremely fortunate situation where we have sort of a visual and physical access to the collection in the museum, and then we can see them up close while we are sort of caring for them. And I sometimes feel extremely emotional looking at quilt, looking at weaving, and it's just that's when you connect to sort of artists, weavers, quilters into a sort of emotional level. You know, every stitch is so wonderfully made and so beautiful, and you know, that's when your imagination takes you to sort of what was I thinking, you know, what was I feeling when they are making things, you know. And but obviously it's extremely important that not only do we have that level of empathy and then looking beyond the work you create, that you collect these stories to enliven and share that with, you know, museum visitors and you know, interested public and things like that. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been really inspiring talking to you all.
Oh, thank you. That's what John would always say. When he gave me a pattern, it was, what are you thinking? What's in your head? What have you seen lately that struck you? You know, there was always that inspiration behind the quilt.
Mm.
And then, you know, as you start designing your own, you put your ideas into it, you put your feelings into it. I don't know of any other art that is so tactile that you can feel it as well as see it. And I'm sure, Jeremy, if you're a weaver, you do the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think people realize. I'm sorry, Jeremy, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, I think it's important for people to realize that, you know, something they see in a museum isn't just a piece of fabric that's been stitched. It's so much more than that. You know, we do plan and think, and, you know, there's so much that goes into something before it's finished, and I think it's really important that people realize that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and John was amazing. He would, 2:00 in the morning, he would be up, and it was like, Dad, why are you up at 2:00 in the morning? He says, I got to get this design done. It's in my head. He had to get done. And then he was just so connected spiritually, I believe, with the quilters and what he was doing. And he would actually make designs, and then he would put it in the bottom of the our sewing supplies. And I would say, Dad, what are you doing with that design? He goes, oh, somebody's going to ask for it. And it would be in there for months. And he would say, no, somebody's going to ask for it. And sure enough, months down the line, somebody will walk into the class and says, you know, John, I'm looking for this design. He goes, oh, you're the one. And he'll pick it up. He goes, this is for you. And I would just look at that and go, how do you do that? How do you make designs of people that haven't even asked for it yet? Mm-hmm. And he was just so keen with that side of him. And I think one of the reasons why is that he was half Hawaiian. His mom was pure Hawaiian. And he was really raised in the Hawaiian tradition of living in this physical world and still having that spiritual world out there that you connected with. And I think all the quilters agree with that. He was so connected. I mean, people, I think, you know, with Pat, I mean, it's so funny because you had to have a story. If you didn't have a story, be very careful of what pattern you would get. Be very careful. I mean, even Tuffy would tell, you know, she sits on the beginner's table and John would design and for them when from the cushion, you would go to a wall hanging, and John would actually help you with the wall hanging. And I mean, she actually, I think, Tuffy, you had one person who says, your father doesn't like me. Why doesn't your father like me? And Tuffy's like, what do you mean? She goes, there's too many points and valleys on this pattern.
Well, no, we would always say, oh, John is mad today.
That's right. John is mad today. All those pointed valleys came in. And I have one quilt that was given to me by quilters, and I call it Cat Archets. And Takako asked John for an archet design, and not an archet design, but a different design. And all of a sudden there were archets. And she said, oh, John, I didn't ask for archets. And he said, well, you got archets because Cissy's cat ate all my archets this morning. So now you have archets.
One of our quilters really had a design by Dad, and when they opened it up to display the pattern before the fabric was even bought, I talked to the quilters and I said, what did you do to Dad? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, look at your design. And she had a lei around the center of her design, and that lei had 108 little turtles. This is a lot of work. I said, you must have gotten John angry or something. And she goes, I think so. But it turned out to be a beautiful quilt. And on another subject, he had one person, he not only asked for what's your story, he actually fed off of the energy that you actually gave him, and you can sit with him and he's feeding off of the energy that you're passing across.
When you're making a design, for example, if you're in Japan designing a motif for a Hawaiian quilt, are you thinking about traditional Hawaiian plants and motifs, or are you incorporating some of your local influences into your designs?
Can I answer that? The designs I've done, my first one, John had given me so many patterns, and he finally said, Pat, you need to sit down and start doing your own. So look around you, see what appeals to you, and start drawing. I also learned in this class, other than the traditional Hawaiian quilting, I learned the reverse quilting. And my favorite design is what I tried to express in my biggest reverse style of quilting, and that was the tribal symbols that a lot of the old Hawaiians had. You see them on a lot of wrestlers and other guys now, but I thought that was an important thing to express in a quilt. And then my granddaughters, two of my granddaughters, chose the colors, and then my oldest daughter reminded us that our family god was the gecko, so our amakua was the gecko. So I put geckos in that quilt as well, and to me that quilt has so much more meaning because of all of those reasons. The colors that were chosen, my design that I wanted, the design for the gecko that my daughter wanted, it all came together to make that quilt.
Yeah, I think with the designing, as long as you stayed within the 1/8 pattern, the 1/8 cutting out in one piece, it was considered Hawaiian. So John did not just use Polynesian designs or cultural history. He did tori'is. He did a quilt for Girls' Day, Boys' Day. He did a 22 by 22 Bible book, which incorporated plats from the Bible. So he did go out of the circle of Hawaiian motifs. Flora. Yeah, he did. And for him is that as long as you came within that cutting out in one piece and the 1/8 design echo quilting, it was still considered Hawaiian. It doesn't matter what the design says because it was telling your story and your tradition.
Can I jump in on that? I just remembered my mom, she made a Hawaiian quilt. This is our family crest.
Oh, there you go.
And it's a Japanese family crest. This actually sits on my father's urn.
Oh.
To keep him warm. So yeah, it's gonna, yeah. So yeah, but it sits on the urn, the family crest. It doesn't have to be a traditional Hawaiian design, just like what Cissy was just saying. This was our story, to keep Dad's urn warm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
なんだろう。Yeah, I designed this. Do you know? Is this? This is Reiyomano Hawaiian weapon. I designed for my students. The core warrior helped to prevent their bouncing. My student bouncing. Core warrior breaks. My students' unfortunate. I told that to my students. They don't know what is this, but they feel it's very strong. So they want to make this design. So I think Japanese don't know Hawaiian culture very well, but I explain that culture or the meaning of quilt. My students understand them. And they want to make them this pattern.
I just want to say thank you to everybody too. I just had this wonderful conversation with all of you, and I miss you, and it's nice to see your faces. And I hope that we get back to class really soon.